By the late 1930s, fear was the currency of the Soviet Union, and no man understood its value better than Lavrenti Beria. Rising out of the violent politics of Georgia, he brought with him a reputation that even hardened Bolsheviks whispered about. Where others relied on ideology or loyalty, Beria relied on something far simpler and far more effective: terror. He mastered it, refined it, weaponized it. And by the time he reached Moscow, he was poised to become Stalin's most trusted and most feared enforcer. When Stalin first met Beria years earlier, he recognized something familiar. Both men were Georgian, both had risen from the margins of the empire, and both possessed a cold, calculating ruthlessness that bordered on the inhuman. But even Stalin, the architect of the Great Terror, sensed an unusual darkness in Beria, an ability to carry out orders with mechanical precision and an eagerness to exceed them. It was this mixture of loyalty and ambition that elevated Beria through the ranks of the NKVD until he stood at the very center of Soviet power. Moscow at that time was drowning in paranoia. Neighbors watched each other. Officers vanished overnight. Entire families disappeared into the machinery of repression. Stalin needed someone who could manage this chaos, someone who could transform the NKVD from a crude instrument of fear into a disciplined machine of control. Beria stepped into the role with chilling efficiency. He reorganized the secret police, eliminated rivals, and centralized authority in his own hands. Under his control, arrests increased, interrogations grew more brutal, and executions became routine. But Beria was not merely an administrator of terror, he personalized it. Survivors later recalled how he personally oversaw interrogations, sometimes watching through a narrow slit in the wall, other times stepping into the room himself. Prisoners rarely lasted long. Confessions came quickly, because the alternative was worse. Beria believed that fear was not just a weapon, it was a science, and he studied it obsessively. His rise accelerated after he orchestrated the downfall of Nikolai Yezhov, the previous NKVD chief. Yezhov had overseen some of the bloodiest purges in Soviet history, but when Stalin needed a scapegoat, Beria provided one. He exposed fabricated plots, revealed inconsistencies, and painted Yezhov as a traitor. Within months, the dwarf, as Stalin mockingly called him, was arrested and executed. Beria stepped into his position, inheriting absolute control over the Soviet security apparatus. From this point onward, Beria's shadow stretched across the entire USSR. He managed the Gulag system with brutal efficiency, expanding it into a vast engine of forced labor that fed Soviet industry. He oversaw deportations of entire ethnic groups, the crushing of political dissent, and the elimination of anyone who threatened Stalin's authority. His name became synonymous with a knock at the door in the middle of the night. Yet what made Beria uniquely terrifying was not just the scale of his crimes, it was the deliberate precision with which he committed them. He kept lists, files, statistics. He monitored every region, every factory, every military unit. Nothing escaped his attention. Even Stalin, who trusted no one, relied on Beria more than any other man in his inner circle. But beneath that loyalty simmered ambition. Beria understood power better than anyone else in the Kremlin. He studied its rhythms. He anticipated shifts before they happened, and he waited, patiently, quietly, for the moment when the Soviet Union would need someone more than Stalin himself. In a country ruled by fear, Beria had become its grand architect, a man whose signature meant life or death, whose presence drained entire rooms of air, and whose loyalty to Stalin masked a hunger far more dangerous. Consolidation of power came to Beria with a speed that stunned even veterans of the Soviet system. Once seated atop the NKVD, he moved like a man who had been preparing for this role his entire life. Files were reorganized, chains of command redrawn, and officers loyal to him installed at every level. Where Yezhov had created chaos through mass purges, Beria preferred something colder: precision. He didn't need millions of arrests to maintain control. He needed the right arrests, the right executions, the right fear placed in the right ears. He began by quietly removing those who might oppose him. Senior NKVD officers disappeared overnight, replaced by men whose survival depended entirely on Beria's favor. Regional commanders learned quickly that disobedience meant death. Messages from Moscow no longer read as guidelines, they were absolute commands, and Beria expected results. Unlike his predecessors, he followed every case personally, reading transcripts, reviewing interrogations, and demanding updates. Nothing escaped his eye. Nothing escaped his lists. His influence expanded further during the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. Each new territory became another arena for Beria's methods. Local elites, politicians, officers, intellectuals, were arrested en masse. Some were deported to the Gulag. Others were executed quietly in cellars or forests. Beria oversaw these operations with clinical detachment. To him, these were not acts of cruelty, but of necessity. The Soviet Union could not afford resistance, and he would not tolerate it. One of the darkest chapters under his command was the Katyn massacre, where thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals were executed in secret. Beria presented the plan to Stalin, framed it as a necessary step to neutralize a potential future threat, and received immediate approval. NKVD execution squads carried out the killings with mechanical efficiency, marking each victim in their ledgers. Beria reviewed the reports personally, confirming that the operation had been carried out exactly as ordered. Inside the Soviet Union, Beria tightened his grip over the Gulag system. Under his administration, the camps expanded dramatically, feeding enormous construction projects, from railways in Siberia to mines in Kazakhstan. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion, starved, beaten, and discarded when no longer useful. Beria tracked labor quotas and productivity charts like an industrial manager, never acknowledging the human suffering behind the numbers. To him, the Gulag was not a moral question, it was a tool of national development. Yet Beria's power did not rely solely on fear. He understood how to manipulate Stalin's trust, feeding him intelligence that flattered his suspicions while eliminating rivals who might challenge Beria's influence. He curated an image of absolute loyalty, presenting himself as a calm, practical servant of the state. When others lost their composure in Stalin's presence, Beria remained composed, deferential, efficient. Stalin valued that. He valued the results even more. During the German invasion in 1941, Beria's role expanded further. As the Red Army faltered, Stalin relied on the NKVD to maintain internal order. Beria supervised deportations of ethnic groups accused of disloyalty: Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans. Entire populations were uprooted and transported across thousands of kilometers in brutal winter conditions. Many died along the way. Beria monitored these operations from Moscow, approving transport schedules and casualty reports with the same detachment he used for industrial statistics. But wartime chaos also created opportunities. As the front shifted, Beria inserted himself into military decision-making, intelligence operations, and industrial planning. His hands reached into every sector: security, police, counterintelligence, atomic research, foreign espionage. By 1943, he was no longer just Stalin's executioner. He had become the architect of a parallel power structure, one that rivaled even the authority of marshals and party officials. What made Beria truly dangerous was not just his ruthlessness, but his adaptability. Others in Stalin's circle clung to ideology or personal pride. Beria shed both when necessary. He could smile politely at a diplomat in the morning, sign an execution list at noon, and dine with Stalin at night without a flicker of moral conflict. To him, morality was an obstacle, not a principle. Through fear, loyalty, manipulation, and absolute obedience to Stalin's will, Beria built a fortress of power around himself, a fortress that no one dared approach, and one that even Stalin, the dictator who trusted no one, relied upon more than he ever admitted aloud. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Union was hurled into a crisis unlike anything it had ever faced. Cities fell within days, entire armies were encircled and destroyed, chaos rippled through every level of government. And in that chaos, Lavrenti Beria saw both opportunity and danger, an opening to expand his influence, and a threat that could destroy him if he misstepped. He responded the only way he knew, by tightening his grip over the nation's arteries of fear. In the first weeks of the invasion, Stalin's rage was volcanic. He blamed generals, ministers, commissars, anyone who failed to predict the German advance. Beria understood immediately that survival required offering Stalin enemies to punish. He delivered them. Commanders accused of cowardice or treason were marched before tribunals. NKVD officers compiled lists of suspected defeatists. Executions rose sharply. Beria made sure Stalin saw him not as a passive observer of the disaster, but as the man willing to take decisive action when others hesitated. Yet Beria's power did not come only from punishment. He also positioned himself as the coordinator of Soviet resilience. He oversaw evacuation programs that relocated factories east of the Urals, supervised the movement of skilled workers, and helped re-establish stolen industries deep inside Siberia. While the Red Army fought on the front lines, Beria ensured the Soviet Union retained the capacity to sustain war. His control over rail networks, internal borders, and labor camps gave him the ability to move resources on a scale no other official could match. But the front lines revealed another side of his authority. Beria directed NKVD barrier troops, units tasked with preventing retreats, deserters, or panic among Soviet soldiers. Men who fled German attacks sometimes found themselves facing NKVD rifles instead. Beria enforced discipline not with encouragement or morale, but with terror. To him, the enemy in front and the weakness behind were equally dangerous. Despite the brutality, Stalin grew more dependent on Beria. Reports arrived hourly, detailing troop movements, factory production, arrests, interrogations, grain shipments, rail capacity, oil output. Beria controlled information as tightly as he controlled people. He shaped the narrative sent to the Kremlin, ensuring that successes were magnified and failures blamed on someone else. Stalin, surrounded by chaos, trusted Beria's structure, never realizing how much that structure depended on manipulation. In occupied territories, Beria's machinery of repression expanded further. As Soviet forces retreated, NKVD units carried out scorched earth directives, destroying infrastructure and executing prisoners who could not be evacuated. When the Red Army later counterattacked, Beria's troops were tasked with cleansing liberated zones of potential collaborators. These operations blended paranoia with revenge. Innocent people were often swept into the dragnet, deported or executed for nothing more than being alive at the wrong moment. Yet even as he carried out Stalin's darkest orders, Beria cultivated an image of efficiency and indispensability. In wartime meetings, he appeared measured and calm, offering logistical insights and intelligence summaries with clinical precision. Commanders frustrated by bureaucracy found themselves quietly seeking his assistance. Ministers deferred to him on matters far outside security jurisdiction. Gradually, Beria transformed himself into something more than Stalin's executioner. He became Stalin's problem solver. By 1943, as the war began turning in the Soviet Union's favor, Beria's influence deepened once more. He gained oversight of armaments production, fuel distribution, and even early nuclear research. Each new responsibility broadened the network of people who depended on him and feared him. Stalin rarely delegated such diverse authority to one man, but Beria's ruthless competence made him an exception. His loyalty appeared absolute. His usefulness seemed unlimited. Still, beneath that carefully crafted loyalty, Beria studied the shifting balance of power. He watched how Stalin's health fluctuated, how rival ministers competed for influence, how wartime urgency reshaped political alliances. Beria's greatest strength was not his brutality, it was his ability to recognize the moment when brute force was no longer enough. By the midpoint of the war, one truth had become undeniable in Moscow's shadow corridors. Beria was no longer merely enforcing Stalin's rule. He was preparing for the future, a future where the Soviet Union might need a new master, and where he, the quiet man with the coldest eyes in the Kremlin, could one day claim that role. As the tide of war shifted in favor of the Soviet Union, Beria's influence expanded into places far beyond the reach of ordinary security chiefs. Victory on the battlefield created new opportunities within the state, and Beria seized each one with the same cold precision he once used to execute enemies in basement chambers. While the Red Army pushed westward, liberating territories ravaged by the Germans, Beria orchestrated the political reconstruction that would follow. He understood that the war was not only about defeating Hitler, it was about reshaping Europe in the Soviet image, and he intended to be at the center of that transformation. With Stalin's blessing, Beria managed the reoccupation of territories previously lost. NKVD units followed the front line, arresting anyone suspected of collaboration, real or imagined. Entire towns were interrogated. Local leaders vanished overnight. In Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, Beria oversaw deportations that stripped regions of those considered unreliable. To him, these populations were not communities but variables, elements to be arranged, removed, or replaced as the state required. His reports to Stalin framed these actions as necessary to ensure loyalty in reclaimed lands. But even as he tightened control over liberated territories, Beria directed his attention to something far more consequential: the Soviet Union's emerging atomic program. Stalin, aware of American and German research, ordered the development of a Soviet bomb. He placed the project under Beria's supervision, not because Beria understood physics, but because he understood secrecy, discipline, and fear. Scientists received access to resources, laboratories, and foreign intelligence, but also constant surveillance. Failure was not an option, it was a crime. Beria visited facilities personally, reminding researchers with a quiet smile of the state's expectations. In these years, Beria shifted from pure repression to strategic engineering of power. He became the man who managed intelligence, industry, internal security, and nuclear development, a portfolio unmatched by any Soviet official. His enemies took note, but few dared confront him. Beria's name alone chilled rooms. He had survived purges that consumed others, navigated Stalin's mood swings, and risen higher than any secret police chief before him. His combination of loyalty and ambition created an aura of inevitability. If Stalin ruled the Soviet Union, Beria ruled everything beneath it. As Soviet troops pushed deeper into Eastern Europe, Beria's role expanded yet again. He oversaw the establishment of pro-Soviet regimes in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. NKVD advisors trained local secret police forces in Beria's methods: interrogation, surveillance, and the suppression of dissent. Elections were staged with predetermined outcomes. Resistance movements were crushed. Communist leaders who strayed from Moscow's directives found themselves removed, imprisoned, or replaced. Beria did not simply export socialism, he exported the architecture of fear. Yet within the Kremlin, his growing power created friction. Military leaders resented his influence over wartime logistics. Party officials feared his control over intelligence networks. Diplomats distrusted his ability to manipulate Stalin's perceptions. Beria's shadow loomed over every ministry, every command, every meeting. He had become indispensable and threatening. Stalin noticed but tolerated him. Beria delivered results, and results were the only currency Stalin valued. Still, cracks were forming. Privately, Beria began to show subtle signs of his own vision for the post-war Soviet Union. He spoke cautiously about economic reforms. He suggested reorganizing ministries. He hinted that the state could not endure perpetual purges. To most officials, these were minor bureaucratic comments. To those who knew him, they were something else. The early sketches of a man imagining a role larger than Stalin's executioner. Despite outward calm, Beria never lost his instinct for survival. He kept files on rivals, monitored conversations, intercepted correspondence. He knew which generals drank too much, which ministers lied to Stalin, which officials secretly doubted the party. He gathered this information not only to protect himself, but to prepare for the future, a future he believed would soon arrive. By the war's end, Beria had evolved into something unprecedented, a statesman forged from terror, a bureaucrat who understood violence as policy, and a man whose loyalty to Stalin masked quiet, calculated ambition. Behind every victory parade, every liberated city, every nuclear breakthrough, Beria's hand moved the machinery, silent, precise, and always reaching for more. Post-war Soviet triumph masked something darker beneath the surface, a system held together by fear and, at its core, Lavrenti Beria. As Red Army banners flew over Berlin and Soviet propaganda celebrated victory over fascism, Beria quietly set about tightening his grip on the empire Stalin had expanded. Peace did not lessen his power, it simply gave him new arenas in which to exercise it. Within the Soviet Union, millions of prisoners remained trapped in the Gulag, their sentences extended or reconsidered according to the needs of the state. Beria treated them as a reserve army of labor. Mines, railways, factories, remote construction projects all drew on camps he supervised. Reports flowed to his desk detailing output tonnage, mortality rates, and disciplinary actions. To most officials, these were statistics. To Beria, they were levers he could pull. Governors who met quotas were rewarded. Those who fell short found themselves under investigation. His reach extended into daily life in ways ordinary citizens could feel but never fully see. Apartments, workplaces, universities, and military units all housed informants. Conversations at dinner tables were repeated in interrogation rooms weeks later. People learned to speak in code, to avoid certain words, to lower their voices when radios played. Beria's name rarely appeared in newspapers, yet everyone knew there was a man in Moscow whose approval or suspicion could decide their fate without trial. Internationally, his influence deepened as the Iron Curtain descended across Europe. In East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and other Soviet satellites, security services were constructed in Beria's image. Interrogation techniques, surveillance methods, and detention systems all borrowed from NKVD blueprints refined under his command. Show trials were staged to eliminate opposition, using scripted confessions extracted under torture. Beria followed these events closely, reviewing reports from local secret police chiefs like a tutor grading the work of ambitious students. Behind closed doors, however, he began to resemble something even more disturbing, a man who believed he was untouchable. Accounts from those who worked near him describe a predator who abused his position for personal gratification. Women summoned to his office or chauffeured to his mansion knew that refusal was not really an option. Carried out in the shadows, these abuses were shielded by the same terror that protected his political power. Few dared speak, and those who did often disappeared. Yet Beria remained careful in public. In meetings of the Politburo, he played the role of the efficient technocrat, offering solutions to economic bottlenecks, security concerns, and post-war reconstruction challenges. He could speak about grain production in one breath and uranium enrichment in the next, always with the same cool precision. Other officials came to resent his influence but struggled to challenge him. Stalin trusted him, and as long as that trust held, Beria seemed invincible. Stalin's advancing age, however, changed the equation. The dictator's health began to falter, and with each new sign of weakness, the question of succession grew more urgent. Within the upper ranks of the party, silent calculations began. Who would control the state when Stalin was gone? Who had the networks, the loyalty, the fear on their side? Beria believed he knew the answer. He cultivated relationships with younger officials, signaled hints of reformist thinking to those disillusioned by endless purges, and quietly positioned himself as the man who could modernize the Soviet system without dismantling its foundations. To hardliners, he presented himself as the guardian of Stalin's legacy. To pragmatists, he hinted that things might be done differently after the Vazd was gone. It was a dangerous balancing act. But if anyone in the Soviet Union understood how to walk a tightrope over an abyss of blood and secrets, it was the man already known, in whispers and in fear, as Stalin's executioner. As the 1950s began, a subtle but unmistakable shift crept through the Kremlin. Stalin was aging. His speeches grew shorter, his movements slower, his temper more unpredictable. Ministers whispered about his declining health, but never aloud. To speculate on Stalin's mortality meant signing one's own death warrant. Still, everyone in the upper ranks understood one truth they dared not say. The Soviet Union was approaching a transition unlike any it had faced since Lenin's death. And no one prepared for that transition more carefully than Lavrenti Beria. Beria sensed opportunity in every sign of Stalin's fragility. He positioned himself as indispensable, efficient, calm, the only man capable of keeping the vast security apparatus functioning. He delivered intelligence reports faster than rivals. He exposed plots at convenient moments. He managed the atomic program with ruthless focus, ensuring Stalin saw him as a guarantor of Soviet power. But behind the facade of loyalty, Beria's ambitions stretched further than any other man in the Kremlin dared imagine. He began speaking cautiously, always behind closed doors, about the need for reforms. He suggested scaling back certain purges, reorganizing ministries, improving industrial management. These ideas were not humanitarian, they were tactical. Beria understood that whoever succeeded Stalin would need the support of technocrats, generals, and administrators exhausted by decades of fear. By presenting himself as the only man capable of modernizing the system, he laid the groundwork for a future claim to leadership. In public, he remained the embodiment of discipline, but in private, he cultivated influence everywhere, in the police, the military, the nuclear sector, and regional party branches. He collected compromising material on rivals, adultery, corruption, mismanagement, suspected disloyalty, and stored it in secret archives known only to his closest operatives. These files were his insurance. If Stalin died suddenly, Beria intended to control the narrative, neutralize threats, and seize the momentum before anyone else understood the danger. Yet Stalin was not blind. He had outmaneuvered ambitious men for decades and sensed that Beria's confidence was growing. In the final months of his life, Stalin distanced himself from several senior officials, Beria among them. Meetings became shorter, invitations became rarer. Stalin's stare, once almost fatherly toward Beria, grew cold. Some historians believe Stalin planned another purge, one that would reshape the leadership for a final time. If true, Beria likely stood at the top of the list. Then came March 1953. Stalin suffered a massive stroke at his dacha after a long evening with several top officials, including Beria. For hours, no one summoned medical assistance. Some claimed they were too afraid to disturb the leader. Others whispered darker suspicions that certain men, particularly Beria, understood that intervening too quickly might save a tyrant who no longer served their interests. Beria's behavior that night became a subject of speculation for generations. He appeared nervous, yet composed. When doctors finally arrived, he reportedly snapped at them, delaying treatment, questioning every decision. Whether through inaction or design, Stalin slipped into a coma. As word spread through the corridors of power, fear turned to calculation. Who would control the security forces? Who would manage the transition? Beria moved first. He placed NKVD units on alert, ensured communication lines ran through his loyalists, and monitored every conversation inside the Kremlin. He visited Stalin's bedside, reportedly sneering with a sense of triumph so thinly masked that even witnesses felt chilled. On March 5th, Stalin died. The Soviet Union trembled, but Beria saw clarity. For the first time, the man who had lived in another's shadow, who had built his career through fear, manipulation, and blood, stood on the threshold of becoming the most powerful figure in the state. He stepped into Stalin's funeral procession not as a subordinate, but as a contender. What he did not yet realize was that his rise had already awakened a new kind of fear, not in the people he ruled, but in the men who ruled beside him. And fear among powerful men is a force even Beria would struggle to control. In the days following Stalin's death, the Soviet Union entered a moment of uncertainty so profound that even seasoned party officials struggled to understand what would come next. The man who had ruled for nearly 3 decades was gone, and the vast machinery of the state, its ministries, armies, police forces, and secret networks, suddenly lacked its central conductor. Into that vacuum stepped Lavrenti Beria, who moved with a speed and confidence that stunned both allies and enemies alike. Publicly, he projected humility. He bowed his head at Stalin's funeral, spoke of loyalty to the party, and expressed condolences to the Soviet people. Privately, his ambitions ignited. He immediately reclaimed control of the state security apparatus, merging ministries and placing key offices under his authority. Officers loyal to him returned to positions they had held years earlier. The NKVD, now renamed but unchanged in spirit, once again operated as Beria's personal instrument. His rivals sensed danger. Georgy Malenkov, nominally Stalin's successor, depended heavily on Beria's support in the first weeks. Nikita Khrushchev, clever but underestimated, watched quietly. Marshals in the military kept their distance. They all understood that Beria's intelligence networks could destroy careers, reputations, and lives before breakfast. And unlike Stalin, Beria lacked even the fragile restraint of ideology. His loyalty had always been to himself. But Beria surprised many by announcing sweeping reforms. He ordered amnesties for hundreds of thousands of Gulag prisoners, mostly non-political ones, but even a gesture of mercy seemed unthinkable from the architect of repression. He loosened censorship. He criticized aspects of Stalin's rule. He halted ongoing investigations that threatened party officials. Some saw these moves as pragmatic attempts to stabilize the country. Others saw them as calculated steps toward consolidating power by winning public sympathy and elite cooperation. In foreign policy, he took even bolder steps. Beria pushed for negotiations with the West, suggested easing tensions in East Germany, and indicated willingness to explore a neutral, reunified German state. To Soviet hardliners, this was alarming. If Beria controlled both domestic security and international diplomacy, he could reshape the entire direction of the Soviet Union, potentially positioning himself as a kind of Soviet strongman with global leverage. But behind every reform, rivals sensed something predatory. Beria kept files, thousands of them on every man in the Presidium. He knew who had lied to Stalin, who had stolen, who had ordered executions, who had pleaded for mercy. These documents were his weapons, and he hinted at them in subtle ways. A raised eyebrow during meetings, a reference to an old report, a quiet reminder of past mistakes. The message was clear. Anyone who opposed him risked exposure, ruin, or worse. The fear that once served him so well now became a double-edged sword. Ministers, marshals, and secretaries who had lived through the purges recognized the signs. They had served under one autocrat already. They would not allow another to rise unchecked. Whispered conversations began in side rooms and hallways. Alliances formed in cautious pairs, Khrushchev with Malenkov, Malenkov with Marshal Zhukov, Zhukov with the generals. What united them was not ideology but survival. Beria, intoxicated by his momentum, underestimated how quickly the ground could shift beneath him. He believed that reforms made him appear modern, flexible, indispensable, a leader for a post-Stalin era. What he failed to see was that these same reforms frightened men who had built their careers under Stalin's protection. If Beria loosened the terror system, what would stop him from weaponizing its remnants selectively, sparing some and destroying others? His arrogance grew. He arrived late to meetings, interrupted colleagues, and dismissed objections with cutting remarks. He acted as though the transition was complete, as though he had already secured his place at the top. Khrushchev watched it all with the patience of a man who understood that power shifts not with explosions, but with silent decisions made in shadows. By early summer, the conspirators were united. They agreed on one thing. Beria had become too powerful, too unpredictable, too dangerous to the state, and to them personally. His enemies did not merely plan to remove him from office, they planned to eliminate him completely. By June 1953, a quiet storm was gathering around Lavrenti Beria. He sensed tension in meetings, glances exchanged behind his back, careful phrasing from men who once deferred instantly, sudden hesitation where obedience used to live. But he dismissed these signs as the anxieties of lesser figures adjusting to a new era. He believed he controlled the security organs, the files, the secrets. He believed no one would dare move against him. In truth, the conspirators had already chosen their moment. Nikita Khrushchev, seemingly harmless and jovial, operated at the center of the plot. He understood Beria's weaknesses, arrogance, overconfidence, and his belief that no coalition could unite against him. Khrushchev quietly brought Malenkov, the nominal head of state, into the plan. From there, they approached Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most respected military figure in the Soviet Union. Zhukov, who had seen purges claim countless comrades, agreed instantly. He understood better than anyone what would happen if Beria gained absolute control. The Presidium meeting of June 26, 1953, would become one of the most fateful gatherings in Soviet history. Beria entered confident, even relaxed. He carried documents under his arm, prepared to lecture his colleagues about new reforms in East Germany. His voice was calm, almost casual, as he outlined his proposals. For a brief moment, the room appeared ordinary, papers rustling, pens clicking, ministers adjusting their glasses. Then Malenkov interrupted. He accused Beria of undermining the state, of acting without authorization, of manipulating the security organs for personal power. Beria froze. No one had ever spoken to him that way in a formal meeting. He began to protest, but his voice faltered when he noticed the expressions around the table, firm, united, resolute. Khrushchev leaned forward, listing Beria's abuses, the fear he sowed, the danger he posed. Ministers who once trembled before Beria now condemned him openly. The executioner had become the accused. As the accusations escalated, Beria's composure cracked. He reached for his briefcase, perhaps to produce documents, perhaps to signal someone outside. He never got the chance. At Malenkov's signal, the doors burst open and armed soldiers flooded the room, elite units loyal to Zhukov, not the security services Beria commanded. Beria's face drained of color. Witnesses later said he looked stunned, like a man who had glimpsed his own death. Zhukov stepped forward and announced Beria's arrest on charges of treason. For the first time in decades, Beria seemed small. He pleaded, insisting they were making a mistake, that he was loyal, that the accusations were fabrications, but his captors had no interest in his defenses. He was handcuffed and escorted out of the Kremlin, past guards who averted their eyes, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or the beginning of another purge. Beria was transported to a secure military bunker outside Moscow, far from the prisons he once controlled. His personal security forces were disarmed. His allies were removed from key positions. His files, those vast archives of secrets he believed would protect him, were seized and sealed. The Kremlin moved swiftly to erase his influence before anyone loyal to him could respond. News of the arrest spread quietly through the upper ranks of government. Many officials reacted with relief. Some who had lived in terror of Beria's knock on their door celebrated privately. Others feared what his removal might mean for the balance of power. But most understood that the Soviet Union had avoided something dangerous, because a Beria unchecked by Stalin might have created a dictatorship more volatile, more unpredictable, and far more personal. Meanwhile, in his cell, Beria faced a reality he had never imagined. He was alone. No interrogators to command, no guards to intimidate, no secrets to wield. For the first time, he experienced the fear he had inflicted on millions. The man who had built his empire on terror now found himself at the mercy of terrified men who refused to be his victims. His fall had begun, and there was no path back. In the weeks after his arrest, Lavrenti Beria vanished from public view as completely as any victim of his own terror apparatus once had. No official announcements were made, no photographs circulated. The man who had controlled the Soviet Union's most feared institutions was swallowed by a system he had helped build. Inside a heavily guarded military bunker, stripped of power and allies, Beria confronted a reality he had never allowed himself to imagine. He was disposable. His interrogators were military officers, not NKVD men loyal to him. They treated him with a cold professionalism he had rarely shown his own prisoners. Beria, once confident and commanding, now spoke in hurried bursts, denying accusations or arguing technicalities. He demanded to see Stalin's files, insisted he had followed orders, pleaded that rivals were framing him. But every word only made him appear weaker. The officers who questioned him were not interested in the truth. They were interested in ensuring the state and themselves were safe from his return. For the conspirators, secrecy was essential. They feared Beria's supporters in the security services might attempt a rescue or a coup if his detention became public too soon. Khrushchev pushed for a rapid trial. Malenkov wanted to legitimize the process. Zhukov insisted on maintaining military custody. Each man viewed Beria's elimination as both a necessity and a safeguard. None of them forgot how quickly he had seized authority after Stalin's death. They intended to avoid giving him even a sliver of opportunity. As preparations for the trial advanced, Beria's psychological unraveling accelerated. Guards reported that he shifted between arrogance and panic, 1 hour boasting that he would be restored to power, the next begging for leniency. He asked for his wife, he asked for his son, he asked for Stalin. None came. The man who had crushed millions beneath a system with no mercy now discovered how merciless that system could be when it turned inward. The trial, held in December 1953, was conducted by a special tribunal of military judges. There was no public attendance, no reporters, no independent defense. The charges were sweeping: treason, terrorism, counter-revolutionary activity, and abuse of power. Khrushchev had shaped the political narrative so thoroughly that Beria was presented not simply as a tyrant, but as a traitor preparing to dismantle the Soviet Union from within. It was a calculated exaggeration, but it ensured that no sympathy would be extended. Beria attempted to defend himself, but the courtroom atmosphere suffocated any possibility of resistance. Every time he spoke, a judge cut him off. Every protest was dismissed as a lie. Witnesses testified under oath, detailing crimes the regime itself had once sanctioned. Ministers who had feared him now condemned him with rehearsed certainty. Generals who once saluted him now spoke of his perversion of state security. It was not justice, it was demolition. For years, Beria had believed information was his shield. He had built his career on secrets: who stole what, who betrayed whom, who feared exposure. But in the tribunal, those secrets were worthless. Nothing he revealed could save him. Nothing he threatened mattered. The Soviet Union was entering a new era, and that era required his erasure. The verdict was inevitable: death. When the sentence was read, Beria broke. Witnesses described him shaking, crying, begging for his life. The man who had ordered executions with the flick of a pen now clung to survival like a drowning man to driftwood. There was no dignity left, only terror. Some guards felt a twisted sense of poetic balance. Others simply felt relief that a dangerous man would never return. Execution followed almost immediately. He was shot in the basement of the bunker, far from the public eye he once manipulated so skillfully. The body was buried in secret. No grave, no monument, no ceremony, just silence. The state erased him not only from power but from memory, ensuring he would never become a martyr to any faction. In the Kremlin, relief mingled with unease. The conspirators had removed the most dangerous man in the Soviet Union, but they also understood what his rise and fall revealed about their system. If Beria could ascend so quickly and wield such power, someone else could too. His death was not the end of tyranny. It was a reminder of how fragile the boundaries of power truly were. For the first time in decades, the Soviet people felt a slight shift. Not freedom, not safety, but the faintest loosening of a fist that had held the nation in fear. And that fist, more than any individual man, had been Beria's creation. When news of Beria's execution finally circulated through the upper ranks of the Soviet state, the reaction was not celebration but a quiet exhale, a release of tension that had built over decades. The man who once controlled the nation's veins of fear had vanished without a trace, and for the first time the Soviet leadership confronted the strange vacuum of a world without him. His fall was swift, decisive, and intentionally silent. Yet the shadow he left behind was enormous. Within days, officials began rewriting the narrative of Stalin's final years. Beria became the scapegoat for every excess, every purge, every injustice. Newspapers, carefully guided by Khrushchev, described him as a monster, a traitor, a criminal who had manipulated Stalin and terrorized the people. In reality, Beria had been an extension of the system, not an aberration. But the party needed a villain who was safely dead, and no man fit that role better than him. Khrushchev used Beria's downfall as a launching pad. He argued that the nation needed reform, not westernization, not liberalization, but a recalibration of the fear-driven machinery that Stalin and Beria had perfected. The Soviet Union could not move forward, he insisted, if terror remained the foundation of governance. It was a bold claim, and one he carefully couched in loyalty to Lenin and the revolution. What he did not say openly was that Beria's execution had opened the first crack in Stalinism itself. In ministries across Moscow, officials who had lived in quiet fear of Beria now felt emboldened. Files were reviewed, investigations opened. Conversations, once whispered, became slightly louder. The vast intelligence networks he commanded were reorganized, fragmented, diluted so that no single man could wield them again. Beria's name, once spoken in dread, became a cautionary tale. His portrait disappeared from archives. His policies were dismantled or rebranded. Even his closest associates erased references to him in their reports. But erasing him from paper did not erase the memory of what he represented. In the Gulag camps, prisoners heard rumors of his death and reacted with a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. Many had suffered under his orders. Others had lost family members to his directives. Some whispered that justice had finally reached the unreachable. But justice in the Soviet Union was complicated. For many, Beria's death did not undo the years stolen from them. It simply marked the end of one nightmare while another continued in different form. Historians often debate who Beria truly was: a brilliant administrator, a sadist, a political opportunist, a patriot corrupted by absolute power. The truth lies in the contradictions he embodied. He enforced Stalin's terror and later proposed reforms. He modernized industries and orchestrated mass deportations. He protected some people and destroyed countless others. He could be charming in private, monstrous in public, calculating in meetings, reckless in moments of arrogance. In him, the Soviet system revealed its darkest duality, the belief that cruelty could be justified in the service of progress. His legacy lived on not in statues or speeches, but in structures he shaped: the security apparatus, the Gulag system, the surveillance culture, the political paranoia that outlasted him by decades. The Soviet state survived his death, but it never fully escaped the architecture he had built. Fear remained embedded in institutions long after his name was scrubbed from official histories. Yet perhaps the most striking part of Beria's story is the way it ended. A man who held the power of life and death over millions, who believed himself untouchable, who navigated Stalin's court with predatory precision, died in the most ordinary manner imaginable for a Soviet victim. Executed in a basement, denied dignity, buried in secret, erased. It was an ending he would have understood perfectly and feared more than anything. In the end, Beria's rise and fall reflected the brutal logic of the system he served. He was created by it, empowered by it, consumed by it. A loyal instrument until loyalty became irrelevant. A master of terror undone by the very terror he wielded. His life stands as a reminder that in a state built on fear, no one, not even the executioner, ever truly escapes it.